Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Fearless Salary Negotiations webinar. I'm excited to walk you all through strategies for successful salary negotiations through identifying and articulating your personal value. Now, the content I'll be sharing today is in partnership with the American Association of University Women, or AAUW. If you're not familiar with the AAUW, they are dedicated to ensuring fair pay and economic security for women. And one of the ways they do so is by empowering women to successfully negotiate salaries. So if you are at all interested in learning more and accessing additional resources, including a workbook that they have to help people feel guided through salary negotiations, I encourage you to visit their website at aauw.org. And of course, since this content is in partnership with AAUW, it has that focus in mind, but it is content that's relevant to all audiences. And so we're excited to have you all join us. So to get started, these are the 4 steps in the salary negotiation process that we will be walking through, right? The first one is, of course, knowing your value and being able to share it with others. The second is knowing your target salary and target benefits. What are you hoping to get out of this negotiation? What are you aiming for? The third is knowing your strategy. And we'll spend a considerable amount of time on this because this is the part that often gets people, right? Like, what do you say? How do you approach it? How do you time your negotiation? All of that is important. And then lastly, of course, practicing. Successful salary negotiations are those in which people feel prepared, armed with information, and those in which they're not entering a conversation for the first time without having rehearsed the words they want to use, right? Because you do want to be compelling in your negotiation in order to try to achieve what you're targeting. And so the more practice you get, the better you will be at it. So to begin, I think it's helpful for me to get a sense from you all on what you see as the biggest challenge in negotiating your salary and benefits. So you should see a poll on your screen with 4 options. So one might be unsure of the salary you should be targeting. Second option is worried about how negotiating may impact the relationship with the employer or with your supervisor, for example. The third is receiving a negative response. And then the fourth is not knowing the right language to use. So as you reflect on salary negotiations, what do you consider to be the biggest challenge?
Okay, thanks so much. It looks like we've got about 80% of our attendees on the line who have voted. I will end the polls and share results now. All right, our top result coming in with 37% of the vote is they're unsure of the salary that they should be targeting. 36% closely behind say they're worried about how negotiating may impact their relationship. 10% receiving a negative response, and then 17% not knowing the right language to use.
Great, thank you, Sam. This is very helpful, and I hope that this presentation will cover all of those 4 points, but it is helpful to know the top 2, which is in regards to information, right? Like what salary number you should be targeting, feeling good about that number, and so all of this will help address that concern. Great, so step 1 is really knowing your value, right? So your salary negotiation or your benefits negotiation is really couched in this idea that you bring a lot of value to an organization, right? Or that you will bring a lot of value to an organization. And so in order for you to make an effective argument for that, you want to understand concretely what that means. So it's important to take a moment pre-negotiation to ask yourself, what differentiates you from that pool of candidates, right? Or maybe from other employees in the company? How do you bring value to your company or organization? And then specifically, what skills, accomplishments, and work experiences demonstrate that value, right? And demonstrate that you will be successful in this position that you're seeking. Now, these are sort of big questions, and so I think what might be helpful is for you to think about sort of an immediate example, right? And be very specific. So for a lot of people, it could be taking an example from a current position you have or a previous position that you held and really break it down. So for example, it might be a project. What did you do to make that happen, right? To complete that project, to reach that particular goal? What specific role did you play? What were some positive results? And then how can you quantify those results, right? We hear this often in our, job search application materials. It's very important to have numbers, right? People are drawn to numbers, and they also give us a sense of the scope of your work and the scope of your impact, right? And so the same applies for negotiations and thinking about the value you bring to an organization. Can you quantify something there? Now, examples of quantification are listed down below, right? They can include revenue and funding, increasing efficiency in some way, if you can put a number to that, or customer acquisitions, savings, and managing employees, all of that. So be creative in how you choose to quantify, right? What makes the most sense? And also ask yourself, what are the metrics that will resonate with the employer, right? What are their goals? Who are they trying to reach in their work? Who are they serving, or who are their customers? And then based off of that, you can have better clarity with regards to what you should be quantifying when you're making these statements. Now, once you have this sort of brainstorming done, the next step is to really put it into words, right? And so part of that is using something like a value statement. And here we have a very general template, right, for one. So I accomplished, X by using my Y skills, which benefited our company by Z, right, results. Of course, this is formulaic, and you want to use your own, your own way of speaking and your own cadence and how you deliver that information. But it is useful to kind of think about the three elements of a value statement, right? You want to show your accomplishments, you want to show how you accomplished that, right? The skills and experiences, and then you always want to show results. So down here, you see an example of one that kind of puts that into practice. I developed a training program for new hires by collecting staff feedback and partnering with our central HR team. That benefited our company by decreasing turnover by 32%, improving office culture, and saving the company an average of $22,000 a year with onboarding costs, right? This is an ideal one, right? You have a sense of what it is they did, what they accomplished, how they did it, right? They collected staff feedback, they partnered with others, and then you have the results. Now, for many people, they say, we don't, it's hard for me to quantify that. I don't have that number that was, the savings number. And that's completely fine. This is sort of a model example, but it might not be, applicable to everyone. And so again, try to use numbers that you can attain, try to use numbers that matter. And if you can't quantify it using a specific number, know that you can still show impact in other ways, right? By thinking about, did you collect feedback after the fact? Do you have anecdotes to share? So all of that is important. Don't get too hung up on the numbers part of it. They matter, but in the event that a lot of your accomplishments can't be quantified in that way, know that there are other ways to show impact. Now, this type of work is easier done when you have a lot of evidence, right, to show for it. Now, many of us can look at our resumes and use that as evidence as we start drafting up our value statements. But for those of us that maybe are in positions where you're trying to ask for a raise, or maybe you weren't actively searching for jobs, this can be a little bit tricky, right, to get that evidence. And so here are just some tips for how you can start collecting that information earlier on and how you can ensure you're your best advocate. So the first one is documenting your accomplishments, right? Keeping a journal and really writing down every single time you achieve anything is so important, right? Because at the end of the day, when you're reflecting, some of us just focus on the biggest projects or the most recent projects, but we don't quite understand all the work that led up to that point, right? And so documenting and having this journal apart from what you regularly do is important. Thinking beyond the task is important. So, many of us focus on the day-to-day tasks that we're in charge of, but really think about how that fits into the larger picture, right? How that advances the company's goals and, and serves your metrics, right? And all that will be important when you're negotiating a salary, because you'll be speaking to someone that might have a little bit less interest in your day-to-day tasks, and they might want to understand how it is that you're benefiting the company as a whole, right? Because you're asking for an additional sort of additional salary, right, or amount to reflect that. Of course, quantify your work, which we, talked about. And then lastly, everything counts, right? So many of us kind of think about our immediate job responsibilities, which is great, but also think about other things you may have volunteered for, right? Like maybe you helped create and start your employee resource group, right? Or maybe you joined a committee to lead some initiatives. And so think about those as well. Everything counts. And if anything, those might show as well that you're someone who's willing to improve the organization or the company. You're willing to do something outside of the parameters of your work. And so all of that speaks very highly of you. So make sure you consider any experiences you've had that are outside of your sort of typical job description. Now, you've done this work in thinking about your value. And so your next step is really understanding your target salary and your target benefits, right? What is that number you're hoping to seek? So these are the 6 steps involved in understanding that target salary. So you first want to research and identify comparable job titles, right? Get a sense of what is that market value for that position, which does definitely vary by location, right? And by experience level. And so once you've done that, you want to establish your target salary, right? Which in many cases can be the market rate, but it might be a little bit higher if you feel like you're a little bit more experienced than a typical candidate, right? So you want to first understand what the market looks like, and then based on that, select the target salary. Based on your target salary, you want to create a range, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. In those conversations, then you also want to think about your walkaway point, right? What's that lowest salary that you're willing to accept? You then want to create a realistic budget, which is not a requirement necessarily in this process, but it helps, right, to get a sense of, yes, you understand the market value of this position, but also what are you realistically, how will you sort of live, and what's the lifestyle you're seeking, and how can that sort of inform your process internally, right? This is something that you don't quite share with like an employer ever, but internally, how is that informing this research that you're doing? And then lastly, understanding the value of benefits, right? The conversation right now is mostly focused on salary, and that's very important, but understanding that the job offers many things outside of that is important, right? Because there could be things that lead to your future professional development and growth, and you want to keep those in mind as well. So as we start going into this conversation, it's important to have a few or define a few of our key terms. So as I mentioned, your target salary is the worth that you are understanding for yourself based on the data that you've collected, right? So this is the number you actually want. A target salary range is the range that you're going to use to negotiate. So studies show that you're more successful in negotiating if you show a range because you're showing flexibility, right? You're showing that you're someone that isn't really thinking about a fixed number, but you're willing to have that conversation. And so having a range is very important, not just like your target salary. And then as I mentioned, your walkaway point is that lowest salary you're willing to accept and still, reach that agreement. And you want to understand this because again, it's, you want to stop yourself from accepting a salary that later you're regretting, right? And for some of us, this is a tricky kind of number to understand, especially during this time when there is that immediacy of wanting to be employed if you're currently unemployed, right? And so, it's a little bit, I think, context specific, right? And individualized, right? Like all of us have different metrics for this, but it is important to understand, like, what is that lowest amount of money that I would be willing to be happy with, right? What is that, that if they make me this offer, would I accept this? Or if my salary negotiations don't go as planned, would I still take this position or not? So when you are starting to search for salary data, it's important to use different resources. The first one that comes to mind is salary.com. This one provides company specific, data. So it's like company provided information, which you can search on, job title and then input location as well. Other resources are PayScale and then also Glassdoor. Some of which include employee provided data. And so I would highly encourage you all to look at both, right? What is the company providing in terms of what it is that they pay their employees, and then what are employees reporting, right? And kind of compare those. And definitely look at location and look at years of experience, right? Because all that matters if you can kind of filter through that to get a sense of what it is that you might want to ask for. So here's just an example of a public relations specialist position from salary.com, and you'll see data that looks like this. And what I would always recommend you start doing is looking at that median annual salary first, right? again, because that's sort of going to be, for many of us, what you want to potentially aim for, if not a little bit higher, right? But then you also, based on that, get a sense of the range, right? You see that at the 25th percentile, you see, $55,000 approximately, and then at the other end, right, about $71,000. And so you kind of get a sense of, here's like the range, if you will, for, positions, for salaries in this position, but really the median is at that 62,000, right? And so once you've thought about and had an understanding of what that median is, then you want to select your target, right? And so your target salary can be the median, can be a little higher. In this example that we see here, it's a little bit higher than the median. And then you want to stretch it upwards to create the range, right? So what's great about this strategy is that the salary that you are targeting is actually the lowest part of that range, right? And so if your salary negotiations go well, but the employer offers you on the lower end of the range, then you're really getting what you want, right? And if they go really well and the employer offers you on the higher end of that range, then you're getting more than what you were targeting for, right? And so that's what we would generally recommend, is putting the target number at the baseline and then stretching it upward. Now, in terms of how you stretch it, you'll want to stretch it at a percentage level that is appropriate given what you're seeing in terms of the data, right? We generally recommend for younger alumni, younger professionals, to stretch it up about 5 to 10%. If you're more seasoned, you can go at a higher range, but we generally say, no more than 20%. And again, you'll want to look at what those numbers look like in relation to what that breakdown of salaries looks like, right? Because depending on what your range is, if you stretch it out too much, it might just sort of show that you didn't do your research, or even if you did, it might, imply that you didn't do your research. And so definitely be mindful of what that salary range looks like. Another way that you can get some of this information, if this is an option for you, is to think through any mentorships you currently have, right? So there might be people in your life that are advanced in their career, that maybe work in an industry that's similar to the one you're already in, and consider tapping into them and having a conversation with them as well about the types of, about maybe salaries in their industry or in their field, right? These are conversations that sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable to have, but I truly believe that they're so important, right? Especially in ensuring equity with salaries, right? We want to start being more comfortable talking about what it is that we make, so that we encourage other people to continue to advocate for themselves and to ensure that we are being fairly compensated, right? So if you do have any mentors in your life, professional mentors, I think it's definitely appropriate for you to ask if that's a conversation they would be comfortable having, just because you want to get into that stage of being able to negotiate, right? So arm yourself with data, and if you can involve your professional network as well, people that you trust fully, I think it can only benefit you. So your next step is really determining that walkaway point, which we talked about. What's that lowest number that you're willing to accept? And that can vary by person. And I think it's sometimes helpful to create a budget as you think about that walkaway point. The AAUW does have resources for people to create a budget and to understand sort of what it is that is going to, like sort of what the cost of living is at a certain area. And another thing to consider really when thinking about your walkaway point is this understanding that your salary is not actually your take-home pay, right? And so your take-home pay varies by area as well, right? Because it depends often on taxes, and taxes vary by state. And so the AAUW does provide some resources online for you to input your salary and then input location and see what your actual take-home pay might be. And this can help you create a baseline walkaway point, so that you understand, okay, this is enough for me to live the life that I need to live, right? And that I'm not, underselling myself too much. So definitely encourage you to visit your website to get a sense of that. Now, lastly in this conversation, you want to think about the overall benefits, right? We've been talking about salaries, but there are many other things that can help contribute to your happiness and also long-term growth in a position. So you see a list there. You often see this, information as well in offer letters, or potentially like on company websites that are for new employees. And so one that I always like to point out is professional development, right? Is there a budget for you to take courses or to attend conferences and to grow in your role, right? Because the more you arm yourself with skills and experiences like that within the company, the more successful you might be in being able to negotiate a future salary as well, right? Or be able to grow in your role. So all those are things to keep in mind as you think about negotiations. Great, so now we're gonna transition into knowing your strategy, right? What do you actually say and do, and how does this conversation go? So here's just a few tips as you enter your negotiation. You should absolutely feel free to bring notes, so that you have your value statements, you have information, you're armed with that to be able to have a successful conversation. You want to remain positive and flexible, right? This is something that is so important. And it's a conversation you're having, and in order to prevent any kind of misunderstandings, you always want to just be very thankful and positive in how you're approaching this, right? Because at the end of the day, you both want to get to that point where you agree on a number and you're able to contribute to the company effectively, right? Next, you want to anticipate your employer's reactions and responses, right? You don't want to be caught off guard. And so we're going to walk through a few of those responses and reactions, and then ways that you can address them. And then lastly, I mentioned this, but you both are on the goal for, both the employer and you want to get to a point where you accept the offer, because at this point that you're negotiating, you already have the offer. And so keep that in mind, right? This is the conversation you're having, and you both want it to end positively. And so definitely know that that you should, feel comfortable having this conversation, and you have every right to try to negotiate. Great. So before we even get to the conversation about negotiation, you often might see that in the process, you're asked some questions that are a little tricky to answer because the employer is trying to get a sense of where you fall in their sort of salary range, right? So we see an example there about salary history, salary expectations. In some states, salary history is actually illegal. So I would encourage you all to look into those states depending on kind of where you're looking for employment. Double check to see if that is a question that is able to be asked. But salary expectations is not, right? That's fair game. And that's something that's often asked. We discourage you from engaging in a specific number with that question because it could really limit you in terms of your negotiations in the future, right? You don't want to undersell yourself, and say a number, and then they had a budget for a much higher number, right? And so whenever possible, if you're filling out a form, if you could just kind of do like NA or 0, or, I think that's always very helpful. If for whatever reason you're filling out a form that requires you to put an actual number, we recommend that you put your target salary number on there. So you can put your target salary number on there, or if you can put a range, that's, also advisable. And then what might happen is as you go through the conversation and then, you do get the offer and you want to negotiate more on it, you can always say that, you, based on new information you learned through the interviewing process, you reevaluated the initial number you put down, and you would want to have a conversation about, a different range. So that's completely appropriate, but I would say we want candidates to try to avoid that. You want to try to keep it kind of vague as possible. So here's some possible responses if you do need to provide this information, or you're asked, by the recruiter to do so on a call, saying something like, this position is not exactly the same as my last job. I'd like to discuss what my responsibilities would be here, and then determine a fair salary. Or something like, I'd appreciate it if you could make me an offer based on whatever you have budgeted for this position, right? And we can go from there. So really just kind of deflecting it. Because again, you will have the highest leverage if you wait until the end and they really want you as a candidate. Now, in terms of salary expectations, you can also say, I'd like to see if I'm a good fit first before we discuss salary, or I'd like to learn more about the role before we discuss salary. So just a few to consider here. So now you've made it through this whole process and you did actually get a job offer, right? What's the next step here? So whenever possible, you want to try to have to schedule a time to speak with your contact about your salary, right? So for many, you might get the offer over the phone, or you might get it over email. If you can try to schedule a time to discuss that, discuss the details of the offer, that's always ideal because it can give you some time to prepare a little bit more, get a sense of like what they offered you fair, is that what you were targeting, and then go from there. So here's sort of a sample pitch, right? You've scheduled a time to talk to someone, and so you can begin with something along the lines of, thank you for meeting with me today. I'm so grateful for your generous offer and look forward to the opportunity to contribute to your team. In reviewing your offer, I did want to discuss compensation. As I shared during the interview process, I have more than 4 years of experience in blank, right? So this is kind of where you include your value statement, right? It doesn't have to be many value statements, it doesn't have to be long, right? But kind of remind them like what it is that you're bringing to this company, right? So as I shared during the interview, here's sort of my value statement, right? Given my experience and the value I bring to this position, I'm wondering if we can explore a salary in the range of, X to Y for this role. So here's where you include your salary, right? Range. And again, this language is like inviting, it's showing flexibility. I'm wondering if we can explore the salary, or I wanted to talk about the possibility of doing this, right? But you are negotiating, right? You're doing so in a positive way, in a way that doesn't feel, that should hopefully not feel uncomfortable, but it is something that you want to do. And then the most important thing you can do here is once you've said the statement is pause, right? So negotiation can be a little bit uncomfortable, and I think some of us might want to fill that void with other kind of things that we want to share. But no, say that, share your salary range, and pause and see what their reaction is. Allow them time to respond. So here's just a few things you might hear from the employer, and then some ways you can address them, right? So maybe they'll say something like, oh, I don't have the budget for this highest salary, right? And so you might say something like, oh, if that's the case, would you be open to us working together to identify ways to cover the salary this year or in the future, right? Or would you be open to discussing an increase for me, right, next year? Or even talking about benefits, right? Would you be open to talking about potentially a budget for professional development, right? And so this is why it's so important to think about the benefits right before you do your negotiations conversation, because that is something that you can kind of segue into nicely. And so the kind of what you're seeing here, the trends are you're asking for something in the immediate future, right? Revisiting that conversation in the immediate future, or you're asking for other ways to receive compensation in the form of benefits. So maybe they'll respond initially by saying that, right? Like, oh, in the future you'll have opportunities for growth. So this is, not something that we're able to accommodate right now. And so then you can say something about, I know that one of the most important things in this role is insert a metric here. If I deliver that metric by this time frame, would you be open to raising my compensation to blank, right? So really kind of speaking the language that they speak, right? If I'm able to deliver on these results, can we talk about increasing my target salary when I can deliver those results, right? And so, maybe they'll say something like waiting until next year. And again, here you're kind of having that timeline a little bit earlier. Like, would it be possible to check in again in 4 to 6 months, right? Or to get a sense of my progress and to get a sense of whether this is a conversation we could have then. So as much as possible, having a response is good, right? Because you're showing them you're prepared for this conversation, and then you're trying to advocate for yourself, right? And not allowing yourself to be shut down by essentially the no that you're receiving, right? Which these are sort of different ways of saying, no, we can't accommodate this. So now I did want to leave some time just to talk a little bit about asking for a raise or a promotion in your current job, which is a little bit different from what we've been discussing in terms of negotiations. So in this previous example, we talked about getting an offer, right, for like a new job. And so raises and promotions are a little bit different. So we're kind of walk through that in this final piece of the presentation. So in terms of asking for a raise, you want to really think through timing, right? You want to decide when is the smartest time to ask. Generally speaking, that's going to be can be around a time in which you deliver strong results, right? Maybe you're working on this like high profile project and you're able to deliver on it, or you brought in new clients or whatever the case may be. Like shortly after basically a big win or a success is a good time to ask for a raise. Another good time to ask for a raise is during sort of annual reviews, right? Because that kind of lends itself to a conversation on what it is that you accomplished in the past year, how you grew, and how you want to continue to grow. And so if you want to kind of wait into that natural cadence, that's also a good time. So those are sort of two to consider. So once you've decided on timing, you want to set up a meeting with your supervisor. So this should be a meeting that's outside of your regular one-on-one check-ins, right? Because your check-ins are probably more project and task specific. And so you really want to set some time to have some dedicated time to talk about this in your professional development. And so you can send them a calendar invitation or send them an email in which you ask if it might be possible to discuss, you know, your professional development in this office and set up that time. You shouldn't really necessarily explicitly say, I would like to discuss my salary, right? Keep it a little bit open and say like professional development or, you know, your career trajectory in this office. I'd love to discuss that with you. Just so that your supervisor is aware. They likely will know it's about salary, but I think it's better to keep it sort of open by not necessarily saying, oh, I'd love to discuss like a promotion or a raise. And then, you know, you want to begin the conversation. You want to like relate the conversation with a pitch, right? Because you're the one that's you're asking for a raise. And so you want to do that you want to navigate that conversation successfully. So again, you want to set up some time to actually meet with your supervisor, you know, via video call or via phone call to dedicate time to this. And then you want to share your pitch. And so the pitch really does include 4 elements, which are similar to what we just shared for salary negotiations, right? So the first one is expressing gratitude for the work that you've been doing or the opportunity to be on this team, right? Expressing enthusiasm for the work that you do, but also for the future and the growth that you're demonstrating in the role. Really highlighting your accomplishments. What have you, how have you demonstrated success, right? How have you helped the company or the organization achieve its goals? And then making the ask, right? And so here's a sample pitch, right? So thank you for talking with me today. I really enjoy working here and appreciate you coaching me to become an integral member of the PR team. This past year was really exciting as I had some major accomplishments for the team. And then you can share, you know, under my leadership, our 2 effective PR campaigns boosted brand awareness and drove 20,000 visitors to the new websites, right? I also secured placements for, you know, X, Y, and Z. And I'm especially proud of the role I played in, you know, X, Y, and Z. I think we're right now at a time when many companies have had to pivot, right, due to the pandemic. And so really think about what are the ways in which you went above and beyond, right, to ensure that you all were still able to deliver, that that you were able to positively impact, right, the organization, that everyone felt connected, whatever the case may be, right? And part of this is going to be determining the goals of your organization, right? What do they care about? What are their values? And then how have you demonstrated that during this time of a lot of uncertainty, a lot of challenges, personal and professional, right? And so really think through that and see if you can share some major accomplishments, right? And so once you've shared that, then you can say something along the lines of, I'd like to talk with you today about increasing my role and responsibilities within the team and how that is reflected in my salary. According to my research, the market rate, you know, for this position is, you know, X to Y. I'd like to be considered for a raise that will bring me into this range, right? And so here what you're saying really is, you know, you've increased your role, you've increased your responsibilities, and based off that and your expertise, this is what you're seeing as sort of a fair range, and how can I get into that range, right? So in this one, this pitch is really raised in that promotion, right? Because you're not really asking for more responsibilities, you're saying, how can I have a salary that reflects the work I've been doing, right? And then what that I'll continue to do. You know, in terms of promotion, that would be slightly different because you would be asking a little bit more for like increased role or maybe like a title change in addition to a salary increase. So definitely play around with the language here. But like I said, the timing is very important. And so you want to make sure that you're thinking a little bit about when you've been able to have the most impact, and is that sort of an immediate impact that you can showcase to your employer. So again, another slide on the benefits, right? There are other ways to ensure that you're happy and feeling supported in your role. And so if salary negotiation is not possible, what are other ways that you can negotiate your position? I talked about professional development. One other way it can be title change potentially, right? I think ideally many of us strive for a title change and an adjustment in our salary. But if an adjustment in salary is not appropriate, given sort of, what's going on, and I know a lot of companies and organizations are strapped right now economically, then asking for a title change, right? That's a way for you to show growth. And I think that can also set you up for success in the future, in the sense that it'll make you more of a competitive candidate for those types of positions, right? So maybe right now you're an assistant director and you want to become an associate director, right? And maybe your pay won't change, right? But by changing your title, that shows growth. And then you're able to, when you're applying to jobs, you're able to be a little bit more competitive because you're applying as an associate director versus an assistant director. So things like that are important to keep in mind as well. Once you've had the conversation, you definitely want to ensure you get it in writing. Many employers will do this automatically, but if not, then you can always just follow up via email and say, thank you again for meeting with me and for being willing to have this conversation about an adjustment in my salary compensation. I wanted to follow up and confirm this and that, and I look forward to reviewing the updated agreement, right, or the updated contract, or whatever the case may be, or offer. So definitely get it in writing, and then you can sign off on it. And then really lastly, thinking it's important for us to kind of take a step back and think about this conversation being something that you'll do throughout the course of your professional life and career. So when you're looking for a new job, that you'll be applying and interviewing, and then when you get the offer, that's a good opportunity to negotiate and accept your offer, right? And maybe you'll continue to be in that with that company or that organization and grow, and then you want to again negotiate when you're earning a raise or a promotion, or when you haven't been given a raise or a promotion and you want to make a case for that, right? And if you're not, if you're thinking of a new position or a new organization, then again, as you seek a new job, you'll probably go through that process again. And so all of that's important to keep in mind, because it is a tricky conversation to have. And it's tricky, and you won't always have sort of the results you're seeking, but it is one that you'll continue having, hopefully, for the entirety of your professional career. And so hopefully the more you do it, the easier it becomes. So lastly, practicing, right? We encourage everyone to practice many times before you actually engage in a conversation about negotiations. And there are different ways to go about doing so. I do know for many people, there is a resource called Big Interview, which is sort of allows you to do video recordings of your interviews. And so although this is not an interview, this is negotiations, you can give yourself feedback in that way. I would also encourage you to engage with trusted mentors and practice in that way. And then of course, if you are a young alum of the college, and you've been, in the last 5 years, graduated from the college, career advancement is here to support you. You can always schedule an appointment with a career advisor through that platform. And then of course, the University Alumni Career Services is here to support all of our alumni. And so definitely engage with those services as, as needed, or even with your personal network if you prefer to do that. But practicing is very important. So then, lastly, here's sort of the recap of what we went over, right? The 4 steps to salary negotiation are understanding and being able to articulate your value, knowing your target salary and benefits, what it is that you seek to acquire in this negotiation, knowing your strategy, what will you say, how will you say it, when will you say it, what's the timing on that, and then finally practicing, right? And feeling confident as you approach the conversation.